Okay, so the second Trump administration, beginning in January of 2025, I first begin by talking about the things he did during the first 100 days, and then I move on to talking about the rest of 2025, and then some updates now in April of 2026. And compared to the first Trump administration, this time the Trump administration hit the ground running. In his first in his first term, he did 30 executive orders or immigration having to do with immigration within the first 100 days. This second time around, he did 175. So a lot more than he did during his first administration. Now, the discussion is about attacking illegal immigration, but many of them, in this case, 33 of them, were against legal, not illegal migration. People who had legal status here, like refugees, who had TPS protection, for example. Other things he did early on during the first 100 days, their students and universities were targeted. There were 6,000 students whose visas were revoked. But then later, a couple months later, in April of last year, a federal judge canceled the revocation of those visas. But there were also many students who ended up leaving when they were told their visas were revoked, abandoned their education in the United States, and left the country. Some of them stuck around and they were able to stay, but they were in limbo for a couple months. Another early executive order had to do with requiring undocumented immigrants to register with the federal government. And, I talked before about the criminalization, how being out of status, being undocumented in the United States is not a crime, meaning it is not a criminal offense, it is a civil offense. But there's been lots of efforts to criminalize being out of status. This is one of those examples where uh, so being in the United States is without being out of status or undocumented is not a crime. But now, if you don't register with the federal government and let them know that you're undocumented, then it is a crime. They make it a criminal offense with a fine and jail time. Day one, he also asserted the right of the federal government and ICE in particular to go into sensitive spaces like schools, churches, hospitals, or the lobbies of courts. And I mentioned the Customs and Border Patrol application that Biden initiated, the CPB One app, for people to sign up for their asylum appointments while they waited in Mexico. That ended up getting changed to the CPB Home app. And now the purpose of it is for undocumented people to self-deport. Uh, and I don't know 100% if this is still the case, but I know last year they were also saying they were offering people $1,000 to self-deport. Yeah.
If they don't register that they're undocumented and they get arrested, do they go to the jails here or do they get sent to their home country? Sent to?
No, they're only incarcerated here. Yeah. And yeah. And to me, this one is really unusual because no one's been talking about it in the last year since this was initiated. And so And I looked it up today and online it says that it's being enforced, but I don't know how. I guess yeah, I'm not sure how it is being enforced. No one's really talking about it. So for me, this is a really strange one. But I think if, you know, it falls into this history and trend of criminalizing, finding more ways to be able to make it a crime. With the second Trump administration, the encounters at the US Mexico border dropped dramatically. You know, President Trump did succeed in his first term, and, you know, with his promises and campaign for the second term, you know, to make it known that you know, that he was not going to allow that the border was going to be closed and that people weren't able to come in. And then again, ironically, this has also made it so that he's had to be a lot more aggressive in the interior of the country in order to try to reach the numbers that he promised of people, you know, the promises he made about how many people he was going to deport. There is also what's referred to as the Roosevelt Reservation. And this is this idea that there's, I think it's 100 feet from the US Mexico border that the US military can occupy. And so there's been this effort to militarize increasingly the whole US Mexico border by asserting the federal government's uh, right to be able to be there and police it and that sort of thing. But most arrests actually have come from jails and prisons or from courts, where people show up to court trying to do things the right way, trying to show up for their court date, show up to renew their visa or uh, or to update their status, and instead they end up getting detained. Um, 287G, I mentioned before, it's a program that started with Obama, but that has really exploded in use. That is the program I mentioned that individual police departments can opt to train some of their officers, or in many cases, sheriff's deputies, to get trained to be able to be able to fulfill the role of a federal ICE agent while they're working in their own police department or sheriff's department. In 2024, there were 135 agreements between the federal government and individual police departments. In 2025, that shot up by 10 to over 1,400. In Wisconsin, there are 19 counties whose sheriff's departments have 287G agreements with ICE so that they have officers that can can act as federal ICE agents. Yeah, Brody.
When they act in that capacity, is that like, is there like a separation between when they're acting as a sheriff and when they're acting as a federal agent, or can they just conduct immigration operations well, like on the job as a sheriff, you know?
Uh, so I think it tends to be individual officers within the department. And so then they'll be very cognizant of when they're acting in their added role. And so, you know, they might have, I don't know, 20 officers, depending on the size of the force. And maybe two or three of them have been trained to do the role of ICE. And so then they'll call that officer in, or once if they can bring a person in, then they'll call that officer in. Or if they don't have another reason to grab that person, then they'll call that one of those officers in out, to the street. And so, yeah, I do think they're cognizant of when they're behaving in different roles, but their regular role is as a sheriff's deputy or police officer, not as an ICE agent. It's only when they need them to be in that role that they do that. Yeah, Ella?
Marked, like present themselves as an ICE agent, or did we?
That's a good question. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
Usually what happens is like, my brother's a police officer,
Mm-hmm.
and I have some connections to, like farm shop, but my brother is in.
Mm-hmm.
He works in the county, that's like 4,000, but that's beside the point, but I have a friend who works in the coffee shop. And usually when they have to do that, most of the time they just call ICE anyways, cause it gets too messy and they don't wanna worry about it, because. Normal police officers they've been historically hated the most, obviously, so they're trying to separate themselves from federal agents.
Mm-hmm.
But usually what happens is like if there's drugs going on, or like if they pull someone over and they find a bunch of drugs, usually that's when they can do extra acts of federalness, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's not like they put on a patch and go knocking on doors and looking for them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No, it's and like I said, most of the arrests come from jails and prisons. And so then that means, when they detain someone, they have the option to call ICE and let them know. And then ICE can come and pick them up if they choose to. But if they have people who can act as ICE agents in the department, they can do more. They can hold them longer and stuff like that. Whereas otherwise, they can only hold them for whatever crime they caught them for, and not anything beyond that in terms of because of immigration status. Unless they have a 287G agreement, then they can do more based on that. Yeah. All right. What else happened last year? I started using the data, the information from as many federal agencies as possible, like the IRS, the FBI, Social Security Administration, even and then anything they could get their hands on, including like health insurance information, car insurance claims. Whereas in the past, historically, even USCIS was kept separate from INS or ICE. USCIS was the one that, if someone wants to become a legal temporary resident or permanent resident or citizen, they would go to USCIS, they fill out an application, they're encouraged to disclose everything, including any crimes they've ever committed and stuff like that, so that they can be vetted and see if they, whatever, like did their time and if that is something that they can be pardoned for or not. But that information, people were told, was separate. Or IRS, people were told, file taxes, pay your taxes, and we're not going to disclose that to ICE or its precursor, INS. But that changed last year. Last year, now the government reserves the right to get information from anything they can access. And then this got augmented with millions of dollars that the government paid to the company Palantir, which is a maker of military AI platforms. And they created platforms and apps for US immigration officials. One platform is called Immigration OS. Another one is called Falcon. And then there's a phone app called Elite that the individual officers have on their phones when they're on the field. And they could take pictures of license plates or people's faces or protesters and get them added onto their database. And so yeah, now it even I forget what it's called, but there's also this system of video cameras throughout the country that is also connected to this, where they can type in a license plate and then random government cameras that are on streets and highways and freeways can catch their license plate and then know where they were last seen. Elsie? They're called what? Flock. Thank you.
What's the legality behind that and regulate who can, because as far as I was aware, it's just like police officers that were able to access it.
Mm,
And a lot of times I've seen it used like for tracking speeding or stolen vehicles.
yeah,
But obviously now as we move to more digital, more AI age,
yeah.
how is that usage going?
Yeah, it's very controversial and it's being contested by different agencies. They do say they're only going to use them, to catch criminals. But then, undocumented immigrants are being treated like criminals. And also, there's been a fair number of cases where they found police officers using them for personal business, for personal affairs, not for catching criminals. And so, yeah, it's definitely controversial, and the legality is being contested. So yeah, it's a controversial thing that's been happening.
Do you
Yeah.
know if there's any locally, because I know they put them in like gas.
I don't know how do I put it. I have learned of government cameras that the public can access here locally and throughout the state. Um, and I don't know. They're at big intersections, at entrances to freeways, freeway bridges, and those are just the ones that are available to the public. And there's got to be a whole lot more that that law enforcement agencies can access. Yeah, and I don't know if I answered your question.
I was more so looking for like the flock.
Hmm.
Like, if you knew if there was any like in our area.
Oh, I would assume so. Elsie? 13 in Eau Claire. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
This one's already individual.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. And there's been a targeting of what the White House refers to as sanctuary jurisdictions. They came out with a list of states and cities that they consider sanctuary jurisdictions, and they've been targeting those places. And so there's this irony that the focus of ICE activity has been in the places where they don't want them. And so it ends up coming across as a political tool of going against political enemies, instead of focusing on the places where they want to crack down on undocumented immigration. And so, yeah, there's been that irony. Some of the places that have been targeted, Chicago. In Chicago, there was that Midway Blitz publicity stunt where they came down like if they were in Vietnam, like rappelling down helicopters and South Chicago apartment buildings, and doing flashbang grenades, and knocking down, tearing down doors, and arresting a bunch of people at 3 a.m. when they did this, of communities, Black and Latino, communities. In Minneapolis, was probably what we've been most aware of. where, they spent several months there, led to the killing of a few people. The ones we're most aware of are Preddy and Good. In Los Angeles, where they sent in not only ICE and all the other federal law enforcement agencies, but also the California National Guard, also the U.S. Marines were sent in to do these operations, again, of kind of punishing political opponents. Portland, Oregon was another place that was targeted. And right now, things seem to have calmed down a little bit. But I think a lot of that is just the news cycle of where, we move on to something else very quickly. And so the media has moved on, but there's a lot of people that are still very much in touch with it. An example of that, there's this, I don't know what to call it, a media company in Los Angeles whose focus is on food. They're called LA Taco, and that's what they do. They do like reviews of restaurants, and they do competitions like who has the best corn tortillas in Southern California, all fresh made. Who makes the best tacos? That's their bread and butter. But since last year, one of their big focuses, and they've been doing this better than any other media source, every single day, well, maybe not every single day, almost every single day for over a year, they've had a daily update on what's been happening with regard to immigration enforcement in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles. And so here I can show you an example of, so there's they call it the Daily Memo. And we're familiar with the word memo, but memo is also the nickname for someone named William or Guillermo in Spanish. And so it's kind of, a double meaning there. And let's see. And so here's the one they released yesterday, for example.
Those are looking more like mass incarceration of people without criminal convictions. And for the trolls, I remind you that being in the US, while undocumented, is a civil offense, not a criminal. Today is Monday, April 27th, and it's day 226 of the ICE siege. And there's a new ICE detention center in California Central Valley, in McFarland to be exact. And according to CalMatters, the 700-bed prison was quietly reopened by the private prison group GEO, which obtained permits and licenses from the city of McFarland without consulting its constituents beforehand. ICE is also planning to detain more children in Louisiana's most toxic and contaminated military site, according to The Guardian. Some recent examples of the kind of cruel treatment that people are subjected to. A mother, for example, was punished in ICE detention by being stripped naked and locked in a small room in anguish after learning her 17-year-old son had been shot and killed. She just wanted to attend this room. In Alligator Alcatraz, ICE is using powder boxes in the form of tortures, and Trump's Department of Justice is chipping away and trying to jail and remove people here with legal status because, in truth, this was never about quote-unquote doing it the right way. The DOJ is going after DACA recipients after a 3-panel judge of the appellate courts sided with the Department of Homeland Security, weakening DACA protections. The DOJ is also targeting about 400 naturalized citizens to remove their citizenship. And here in UC Merced, police is also now sharing license plate data with Border Patrol, which raises the question, A, does this violate SB 54, our state sanctuary policy? And B, are other UCs doing the same? And speaking of targeting vehicle plates, the raids continue here in Southern California, and we've been seeing a lot of vehicles targeted and stopped. In some cases, violently pulled over. In others, people were profiled and let go. In one example, a reporter Aisha Wells Palomares an exclusive story on LA Taco. A US citizen being pulled over, yelled at, his window smashed, and taken away by ICE ARO agents on a reckless drive before they verified his identity 30 minutes later and then let him go. In Downey, a mother was also ambushed while in a car by several agents who screamed and harassed her while she was in her car they were trying to open her door. They eventually let her alone. In Santa Ana, a frightened woman was chased by agents who deployed a spike strip, disabling her car, and according to witnesses, chased her into a residential street on foot with their guns pointed at her as she ran. She was eventually detained, and Santa Ana police arrived to file a collision report and tow her vehicle away. We have reports of abandoned work trucks, more fathers and mothers targeted, and of course, the jails. The full list of reports is on LATaco.com as always. ICE has not stopped, and they're planning on detaining more families, including children. Remember to stay safe and stay vigilant, folks. ICE is continuing to pick up the pace, now matching detaining numbers close to those that we were seeing in the Grand Bovino days. Last week, at least 70 people were taken, most of them, about 40, from jails, according to 805 Rapid Response, who say agents are profiling people as their leaders.
All right. So yeah, that's an example of what's been still happening in LA, even though it's not in the national news anymore. And so yeah, there's been an increased militarization of immigration enforcement. You know, the wearing of fatigues, looking like military. You know, wearing bulletproof vests. But not always. Early on, it was a lot of people dressed like civilians without identifying themselves as ICE, wearing face masks. And so a lot of people were being detained and taken away by people that we didn't know for sure whether they were really law enforcement. And you know, kind of like secret police, reminiscent of the Cold War, reminiscent of how people were disappeared in Latin America during what they called the Dirty Wars during the Cold War. And so there were a lot of questions about due process, whether people were getting their civil rights honored, whether people were getting habeas corpus. You know, were they having their opportunity in front of a judge to be told why they were being detained? There's a lot more we could get into, but detention in general increased by 50% in 2025. But again, this has been the overwhelming majority has been enforcement in the interior, not at the US-Mexico border. And the overwhelming majority are non-criminal immigrants. Many of them are people that are here, they're legal immigrants or legal refugees, you know, trying to update their status or just checking in or waiting for renewal or stuff like that, and they end up getting detained. Other things that happened last year, we started deporting people to they're not random countries, but they're deporting people to countries that they weren't from. The US government made agreements with these countries: Costa Rica, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Peru, India. We also sent immigrants to Guantanamo Bay and our base in Cuba. Is just people were sent all sorts of places. That reminds me, there was also a country in Africa that we were sending people to. Right now, I can't remember which one. President Trump also designated Tren de Aragua and 7 Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. And we were justifying a lot of this by President Trump was trying to use the Alien Enemies Act from 1798 to specifically target Venezuelans, claiming that the United States was being invaded by uh, foreigners, and therefore, we could just remove them. Yeah, Emily, go back. Mhm.
There's also a whole thing about trying to use like tattoos to prove someone's gang affiliation to say they were quote unquote terrorists.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. We sent 238 Venezuelans to El Salvador. We claimed that they were either Tren de Aragua or MS-13. Yeah, we claimed that they were all Tren de Aragua and that 23 of them were MS-13 members. And yeah, the evidence for them being Tren de Aragua or MS-13 was their tattoos or social media posts. And there's some really good examples of how wrong they were. We paid El Salvador $15 million to take these people and put them into their new maximum security huge prison called CCOT. And it was this whole big publicity stunt. They brought out everyone to display them and take pictures of them and see how they they get them naked and pose them in these ways. And 75% of the people sent to CCOT had no criminal convictions or even criminal charges. 22% of them did have a criminal record. There were 12 who had been accused of murder, rape, assault, or kidnapping. But even with the ones with a criminal record, the vast majority were for nonviolent offenses: theft, shoplifting, and trespassing. And so again, you find 12 people among them that are accused of serious crimes, and you punish 238 people and paint them with the same brush to justify the treatment of all. Elsie?
Like the max security prisons. It hasn't really been confirmed, but there's like speculation about how it's like people are jailed in a prison, but they never get out.
Mm-hmm.
Yet like the numbers.
Yeah.
There's not a correlation with the numbers, and people are like almost kind of calling it like a death camp.
Yeah.
Like, is this the same?
Yes, it is.
Like, I've seen like the burned fields. Like using Google Maps, or like surveillance images of like how the ground has like changed. There seems to be like more really considering like incinerators on the.
Oh, I have not heard of them killing people, like incinerating people, anything like that. Like no, I'd be curious to look into that. No, at least I haven't heard that. That doesn't mean, but yes, they did say, now this is a new prison. It's only been around for a few years. This is where I brought this up when I was talking about MS-13 in El Salvador and the President Bukele. And so, yeah, I brought it up then. They make big claims. They say people who are sent to this prison are in this prison for life. There's no getting out. But I mean, if the prison's only 5 years old, that's a premature statement to make. Not to mention, one of the people that we sent to this prison, right now I forget his name. One of the persons we sent to this prison ended up getting a lot of political attention in the United States, and they did send them back. And so they're claiming everyone who goes there is there for life, but we already have at least one documented case of someone that they were able to get out. Now that person was brought back to the United States. I think this was an embarrassment for the Trump administration. And so then, because a federal judge had said that they had to take him out, that he was innocent, that he should not have been sent in the first place. Trump administration was really upset about this. They found some other reason to arrest him and charge him and detain him again. And I think he was sent to Africa. And it's just, they were just determined to be able to say they won and that they got him. And so, yeah. And so, yeah, a lot of these things happening are reminiscent of the past, of questions of how our children are gonna judge us for what we allow to happen during our own times, and who we're electing to office and so forth. There's been a lot of legal challenges. Just within the first 100 days, there were 50 legal challenges, 3 of them going to the Supreme Court. Now, some of the things we've learned from those early challenges, especially the ones going to the Supreme Court, they have backed up the idea that the executive branch has authority over immigration. But they've also been deciding on the side of due process and judicial review. And then there's that one of the early first day executive orders was to try to get rid of birthright citizenship. And that's been still blocked in the courts. And so that may be decided soon by the Supreme Court. We'll see. Throughout the rest of the year, there were more than 700 cases by 225 judges that have ruled against the current administration's immigration policies. But there have also been 8 judges that have upheld the new detention policies. So, there's been a lot of legal challenges. A lot of the overwhelming majority of judges and cases have been lost by the Trump administration, claiming they're overstepping and not giving people their rights. But they've also won some. Mm-hmm.
Explain what like birthright citizenship, like I'm just confused. So like you said your parents were born in Mexico, correct?
That's right. And they came here illegally.
Yep, and so you were born here.
Yes.
So that would strip you of your citizenship.
If they had passed this, yes. Although you're right, there is discussion about, I think that part for me is still unclear.
That's
how much if and how far they're willing to go back, or if it's just from that moment forward. But yeah, I mean that would be a whole nother story if not only not allowing future children born in the US to automatically be recognized as US citizens, but if they went back and said, okay, your parents were undocumented when you were born, so you shouldn't be a citizen, you know, that would be much bigger repercussions, implications for a lot more people. Yeah, I'll see.
It's kind of like a spiral on like birth rate session, citizenship. There was like one event, like 14th Amendment, how it's being brought up
Mm-hmm.
in like birth rate citizenship case that's granted in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
No, if they do weigh with Trump and in Trump's favor for the birth rate citizenship, would that broke the 14th Amendment? Like how, like constitutionally, how would that look?
Yeah.
That's more my like big picture. How would that
I
look?
think it would just be they're doing this because they figure it's easier to do this than to amend the amendment. And so then it would be this decision would be an interpretation of the amendment so that they don't have to change the Constitution.
Some effects. I'm not really aware of any other court cases about if there any other amendments they're hoping to fight against, but would this kind of like open the door for more cases to be pushed to like amend the amended courts? Like would it alter more amended interpretations?
Mm, yeah, no, I think they're separate, separate cases, separate efforts. Yeah. Yeah, Connor.
I'm just curious how like, because I know the US is like one of the few countries that birthright is citizenship. I think there's like, so when I was abroad, I learned, like when I talked about it, everyone was like, what are you talking about? That's not a thing. And I'm just curious how like, you think that the impact of not many countries having it will affect the ruling, if that makes sense.
No, I think it has zero bearing. Zero. It's we don't decide the interpretation of the Constitution based on what other countries do. Yeah, it's what does our Constitution say? Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah. Yeah. Good job asking questions. All right, and a few updates here. At the beginning of this year, there was a travel ban and a visa pause for 75 countries. And so people from these countries can't come to the United States, can't travel here from to the United States, and people from these countries can't apply for visas, can't be approved for visas. And so yeah, and people argue that this is political, obviously, and that it could also be, there's also been accusations of it being racist, like forbidding most of Africa, but obviously not South Africa, or kind of President Trump's. So yeah, it's just, but yeah, there's lots of countries now. The White House argues that the countries they chose are the ones who have a higher percentage of people here that are basically like on welfare, that are on government benefits, and that's how they chose who they're going to put on pause. But again, I mean, this is a legal way for people to be able to visit the United States that they're being stopped from using. There are people that are legally here on work visas, and their work visas are no longer being automatically renewed. And so then that opens them up to be here out of status and be deported as well. They've also made it harder for employers to hire foreign workers. They just added a fee of $100,000 for employers to be able to employ people, foreigners with an H-1B visa. I don't know if it's per person or per employer, but I would assume it's per person. Like it needs to be, which means it's just for, people who make a lot of money, people that are really going to be worth it for the employer that, they're talking about that amount of money. And then we also revoked the TPS, the temporary protected status, for people from Venezuela, Honduras, Nicaragua, and many others. 680,000 people that are here legally as refugees are now being put in a position where they may end up being here illegally, and so then subject to deportation. And then there is all the people that have been dying in ICE custody. In 2025, there were 32 people that died in ICE custody. That includes, the two we're most familiar with, Freddie and Good, sorry. And a lot of these people are being detained and have health issues that get neglected and they die that way. And then there's other people that it's in the process of being detained. That number, by the way, of 32 is more, is like the highest number in over 20 years. It's a higher number than all the people who died during all 4 years under Biden. It is definitely an increase. And this year we're at a rate to surpass that with 17 already have died this year. There was another victory in the courts for people who support immigrants. Just yesterday, a federal court of appeals rejected the Trump policy of doing mandatory detention for as many people as possible and without giving them access to bond. And so that, if you're being detained for immigration purposes, we're going to detain you and not give you an opportunity to get out of detention. That such broad policies without exception were just yesterday rejected by a federal court of appeals. So a lot of legal battles going back and forth. Alec?
Most detention centers also privately owned.
Yes, 70% of them are. Yeah. All right. Let me pause this.